this relatively new church in Antioch, a Gentile church. How do they respond to this need in this Jewish church in Jerusalem? How did they respond? Well, apparently, these Jewish Christians were the ones most affected by this famine when it hit. It doesn't tell us for sure why, but it may possibly be because a lot of these Jews that had become converted on the day of Pentecost had come from various parts of the world, and now they're part of the church in Jerusalem, and they're poor. They need help meeting their needs and so forth. And we see that early in chapter 2 of Acts, how they were sharing with one another to make sure everyone was taken care of. Well, these Christians in Antioch, Gentiles, they learn about this famine that's going to come, and so they determined to send relief to Jerusalem to help the poor Christians there. And it's interesting. We see the power of the gospel in breaking down social barriers. I mean, the Jews and the Gentiles did not get along very well. Especially the Jews didn't think very well of the Gentiles. The Gentiles didn't think very well of the Jews. But what was it that brought peace and unity among different races and ethnicities? It was the power of the gospel, what the gospel had done in their hearts. We see that evidenced here in our own congregation. When you look out at our congregation, there's people here from all different nations and kindreds and tongues. We're all here. Those of us who are believers, we love one another. We have affection for one another. We're devoted to one another. We take care of one another. Why? What's done that? It's the power of the gospel of Jesus Christ. The experience that we have had of the grace of God in our own lives. Caddy's comments on this, on the church in Antioch here, are to the point, I think. He says, this represents a practical mark of a true church. It is one which lovingly, generously, and eagerly does all that it can to alleviate the sufferings and privations of others, and I would add, as the case here, particularly of those who are of the household of faith. Galatians 6:10. Now, this is something we've seen already in the book of Acts, in those early snapshots Luke gives us of the church in Jerusalem. We see how they took care of one another. They shared with those in the church who were in need, as I said a moment ago. So these early churches were marked by this brotherly love, including the church at Antioch. It was evident they had passed from death unto life because they loved one another. And this love was not merely in word, but it was also in deed, practical deeds of love and generosity. And this has always been true in church history. Wherever you have healthy churches and a vibrant Christianity. And I could go on with this. Our time is running out. A whole series of sermons could be preached on this. Let me just point to a few of the reasons why this is important. First of all, because being generous with what God has given to us is something that is much insisted on in the Scriptures. It's not a little periphery thing stuck over in the corner of the Bible somewhere. It's much insisted on. It's really amazing. Certainly we can't look at all of them this morning, but just limiting myself to a few texts just in the New Testament. Jesus in the parable of the sheep and the goats. Matthew 25 speaks about feeding brothers and sisters who are hungry, showing hospitality to them, clothing them when they are naked, visiting them when they're sick or in prison. And he says, inasmuch as you have done it to one of the least of these, my brethren. And I think what's underlying that passage really is the doctrine of union with Christ. That those who are believers in Christ are united to Him in such a way that they're one with Him. You remember what Jesus said to Paul on the road to Damascus? He said, Paul, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? You see, when you persecute my people, you're persecuting me. And Jesus says, when we do this to one of the least of these, His brethren, you've done it to me. In the epistles, we have the exhortation of Romans 12:13, distribute to the needs of the saints. The command of Hebrews 13:16, but do not forget to do good and to share, for with such sacrifices God is well pleased. And of course, the entirety of 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and 9, those long chapters, is devoted to this principle, this practice of Christians being generous and sacrificially giving and proportionally giving of what God has given to them for the work of the kingdom and for the needs of those among God's people who are suffering. And then, of course, as we've already seen, the Scriptures underscore that this matter of generosity is an essential mark